Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining our talk today. My name is Lauren Gilbert. I'm the Senior Manager for Public Services at the Center for Jewish History. If you joined us a little early, you saw a slideshow of upcoming events, and you can sign up for any of those and get more information about them at the calendar on our website, which is cjh.org. The chat function is disabled for participants, so you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and I see some of you are already doing that, so thank you. We'll get to questions at the end, but you can type them in as we go along. The program should be finished in about an hour, and it is being recorded, and it will be available on the center's YouTube page and webpage within a few weeks. And if you registered for this program, you'll get an email with a link to the recording. If you need to enable the live captions on your screen, click on the three dots on the lower right, click live transcript, and then choose enable auto transcription. When you registered, you should have received a link to order a discounted copy of the book with 25% off plus free shipping, but I will put the link in the chat in a little while. Okay, let me introduce our author. Arthur Lubow is a journalist and critic who has been writing about the arts for national publications for more than 4 decades. He has been a staff writer at The New Yorker, a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. He is the author of Diane Arbus, Portrait of a Photographer, which came out in 2016, and Man Ray, The Artist and His Shadows, which was published this month. He lives in New York City and East Haddam, Connecticut. And he is coming to us tonight from Memphis, where he's on location for a story. So thank you for zooming in.
Very good. Happy to be here.
So just to start, what was it like to write a biography of someone who was so intentionally elusive, who obscured his own history and tried to really make himself unknowable? I mean, how do you research somebody like that?
Right. Well, there is something a little bit perverse about it. But I am a journalist after all. So I'm accustomed to going places where perhaps I'm not welcome. I don't know, so much about Man Ray is ambivalent and self-contradictory, but he does seem to have been fairly single-minded and adamant in his belief that biography was not a worthwhile pursuit, and that an artist's art should stand for him. I mean, he told a niece of his once who asked what he was really like. He said, "I'm an enigma, and the most you can see of me is in my art." And the art is very masked. So it was a little bit challenging. And in fact, part of the reason that I chose the format that I chose, in which the book is divided up into chapters about his relationships with various people, is that I thought that almost through this kind of refraction, you might get a clearer image of somebody who, as you say, very much didn't want you to have a clear image of who he was or what he was like.
And why, specifically, why do you think he tried to hide his Jewish roots, or at least never wanted to discuss them?
He certainly did not want to discuss them. And once he wrote in his journal, not for publication really, that if you could imagine that somebody had changed his name to disguise his origins. I'm getting this slightly paraphrased, but if he had done such a thing, then why, on being asked, would he want to talk about it? And there is something quite logical about that. You know, he really created himself very consciously as an artist. I think, by the way, that, I mean, this is part of the Jewish Life series. I don't think he was unique as a Jew in the sense that he wanted to construct a persona for himself that maybe didn't contain an obvious Jewish strand. The name change obviously disguised the fact that his birth name was Emanuel Radnitsky, which sounds Jewish. And he and his brother, his younger brother, persuaded their father that the family should change the family name. So they all changed the name, which again was hardly unique at that time. But when people would ask him why he was called Man, and I should add that he was known as Manny as a kid. So it was a fairly easy splice to turn Manny Ray into Man Ray, which is much better, of course. So people would ask, Man, right? Why you what kind of name is that? And his line was, well, when my father came to the hospital and they saw me, he said, "Oh, it's a man." And that canard finds its way into, among other things, the Roland Penrose biography of Man Ray. So I would say that he wanted to disguise all of his origins, including his Jewish origins, and he did it pretty successfully.
So he grew up in an immigrant family in New York, yet he never really felt at home in New York. Why do you think that was?
That was mainly because he was not appreciated in New York as an artist. What he was doing, and maybe we'll talk about some examples of that later, was very unconventional and very ahead of its time and very playful and not at all in the mold of classic painting and sculpture that was appreciated. So that was one reason. The reviews, he wasn't ignored. He got a fair amount of attention early on, but he was not appreciated. And people thought he was a humorist. He said, he used that word, that people thought of him as a humorist when he didn't mean to be a humorist. He was quite serious in his intentions. When he got to Paris, he found that there was an entire community of people who did understand him, even though he couldn't speak French and they couldn't really speak, most of them, English. So there was some difficulty in making himself understood verbally, but intellectually and conceptually, they got what he was doing. And another thing about Paris, which was not true in New York, is that artists and writers hung out together. There was a lot of cross-fertilization, you could say. And in New York, people were siloed according to what they were doing professionally. So he really liked that too. Most of his friends in Paris were writers, not other artists, and they appreciated each other.
So despite his own desire to appear sort of sui generis and hide his own origins, in your book, there are some ways that you see the example of the influence of his father's work as a tailor. So can you talk about that a little bit? And I know we have some slides queued up for this as well. So maybe we can get those going in just a sec.
Right. Well, both parents worked as tailors, in fact, and the kids also chipped in sometimes. I mean, again, it was like a home industry kind of setup, which was far from unique. And many Jewish immigrants at that time, my own paternal grandfather, for one example, were tailors. It was a very common trade among Jews. And so this is the painting that gives my book its subtitle. It's called The Rope Dancer, Accompanied by Her Shadows. And the way it came about is that Man Ray started cutting out colored pieces of paper to get the form of the rope dancer. Rope dancer is what we call today a tightrope walker. And he saw them on the floor, and he liked the pieces of paper and those shapes so much that he changed his concept of what the painting would be. Although he did put a little at the top, I think you can see, there is an outline drawing of the tightrope walker. But what these cut out pieces of paper look like, not just to me, I think to anyone who sees them, is the kind of pattern cutouts that he would have seen in fabric on the floor of their apartment when his parents were working. And in the next slide, you can also see the another bit of a Taylor influence. This painting he made right before leaving Paris just when war was the Second World War was obviously on the horizon. And he talked about this painting at least once, talking about how when he was a kid, he would have these dreams of figures dressed in very bright geometric patterns. But what he doesn't say in talking about the painting is that the figure on the right is a female mannequin of a tailor. And again, that is something that he would have seen from his parents' work. So, you know, it's not like much of Man Ray, it's oblique. It's not a direct allusion to his Jewish origins, but it is it's an oblique allusion to his origins, and there is a religious correlate to that.
So despite the fact that he spent his adult life pretty much away from his family and not interacting with them much at all, he did have some really important artistic friendships. So can you talk a little bit about those and how they affected his artistic development?
Yes, I mean, I think they go together, those two things, because he divorced himself almost completely from his family, and he took on, as what you might call his family, other artists. And, you know, we can talk about two, for instance. I mean, early on, Alfred Stieglitz, who, as it happens, was of German Jewish extraction, and was an extremely generous and farsighted person, as well as being a great photographer, mentored Man Ray, as he mentored many, many people. I mean, he really was tremendously generous. So if you look at the next picture, you can see that this is a photograph that Stieglitz took of Man Ray in Stieglitz's a place called 291, which was his exhibition space. And 291 was a place for very advanced art. Not just in New York and not just in the country, but really in the world. I mean, Stieglitz gave first shows to the first show, one artist show to Picasso and Cézanne's watercolors and late Rodin drawings, which were also not like the Rodin that we normally know, but were advanced art for the time. So so Stieglitz certainly was a very important person for Man Ray. He encouraged Man Ray to take up a camera, which would become very important to Man Ray. And at the time that Man Ray knew Stieglitz, he needed a camera because he was having a show of paintings, and he needed to have them cataloged, and he also needed images to be given to the press. And he wasn't happy with the way other people had done it. So he learned how to do it himself, which would become very helpful to him later. And Stieglitz also, it seems to me, although Man Ray never said this, there's a very, we'll get to Duchamp right in a minute, but to talk about Duchamp now, Duchamp did something extremely provocative, outrageous really, and still famous, legendary. He entered into an independent art show, a urinal, which he called Fountain, and it caused a great uproar. And but what's relevant here is that we know of the original Fountain through a Stieglitz photograph. And Stieglitz, because the urinal itself was lost, but the photograph remains. And Stieglitz photographed it in front of a Marsden Hartley painting with very moody lighting, and it's a terrific picture. And this also, although again, Man Ray, artists, it's not just Man Ray, artists don't like to give this kind of credit to their influences, but it seems to me that, as you'll see, Man Ray used that idea very effectively. So now,
you want to talk more about Duchamp?
Let's talk about Duchamp a minute, and then we can go. Yeah. So the most important friendship of Man Ray's life was Duchamp, with Marcel Duchamp, who he met in New Jersey in God, I should know this, but I'd say 1917. And they immediately, I mean, there's again one of these stories that they didn't speak each other's language. So they played tennis, and Man Ray would call out the points. They were playing tennis without a net. I'm sorry, that's the other important thing. They were just hitting the ball back and forth, no net, and Man Ray would call out 15, 30, 40, and Duchamp would say yes after each thing, after each call. They had this immediate rapport. It's, I think, one of the great friendships in art history. It went on for 50 years. I mean, there's so much one could say about it, but I think what's so appealing in part is that it was not at all competitive. I mean, not at all, which is rare. And it was extremely supportive, and it was, and they got each other completely. I mean, their senses of humor were in perfect alignment. They had the same kind of interest in women. And Man Ray, as a photographer, captured a number. I mean, he captured an alternate persona of Duchamp. He captured there's a work called The Large Glass that is one of Duchamp's most famous pieces that Duchamp was working on at the time. Man Ray photographed it leaving the camera aperture open for an hour to get this very strange sense of all the dust on top of this glass. It looks like an aerial photograph. So there are many works that are, I guess you could call them collaborations, but they're a little bit different than that. They're Man Ray documenting what Duchamp was doing, and both what Duchamp was doing and Man Ray's document are works of art in and of themselves. So it's a really wonderful friendship, and it lasted until Duchamp's death, which happened actually. Man Ray and his wife had dinner in Paris with Duchamp and his wife. They went back to their apartment, Man Ray and Juliet, and got a call from Teeny Duchamp saying that Man Ray had just keeled over in the bathroom and died instantly. So it was a very, and just one more note on that. And then Man Ray, incredibly sort of, got his camera, his tripod, and went back to Neuilly, north, a distance from where Man Ray was living, and photographed him as a deathbed photograph, which he'd never displayed, but I think, again, it's moving to me because he was doing it. It seems to me Man Ray had photographed Proust on his deathbed, the most famous Parisian photographer before Man Ray, Nadar, had photographed Victor Hugo that way. It was a way to commemorate a great man who was dead.
So those are a couple of his important friendships. He also had a number of intense relationships with women. So can you talk about some of the women in his life?
Yes, I mean, there are 4 really. And the first one is the next slide, Adon Lacroix. And we don't have an actual photograph of her. So this is a drawing that Man Ray made of her. The surrealists like to do these kind of questionnaires or polls, and one of the questions they asked was, what was the most important encounter of your life? And Man Ray said it was with Adon Lacroix, my first wife. And part of that was because it was with Adon that he lost his virginity, but also it's even an intellectual kind of initiation, because she was Belgian and she really was his first exposure to French culture. She was very well-versed in French literature, and she introduced Man Ray to that. I mean, she was a poet, and so she knew what she was talking about, and it was really instrumental for opening Man Ray's horizons. And then when he got to Paris, he had a relationship, you have the next slide, with this, again, she's now a legendary character. She was known, her name was Alice Prin, but she's known as Kiki de Montparnasse, and she was like the, the queen of Montparnasse. Ernest Hemingway, after she died, said that she ruled over Montparnasse more than Victoria ruled over England. And she came from the provinces. She was an illegitimate child. She came to Paris, where she really, I mean, she was, physically attractive, but I mean, she really succeeded on the force of her personality, which was, by all accounts, just remarkable. And Duchamp had said that the way for Man Ray to learn French was to find himself a French lover, and he did in Kiki. And they had this volatile relationship, but it was very, it was real, and it was passionate. Especially, I mean, she was a very passionate person, more so than Man Ray. But she was also a kind of muse. And if you look at the next slide, you can see that. Yeah, this is one of Man Ray's most famous photographs, Blanche et Noire, and people commented on the perfect oval of Kiki's head, which you can see here. I mean, it's a very interesting picture, and people have said a lot about it. But from Man Ray's perspective, it was a surrealist notion that women were more in touch with the primal and the primitive than men. And so this is a kind of surrealist homage to woman, and she's dreaming, or seems to be dreaming, of something primeval, you could say. And then in the next photograph, which is again one of his most famous, no, the right, yeah, well, there are two, right? So the one on the left is a still from a film that he made called Retour à la Raison, Return to Reason. And this is Kiki's torso. And you can see on the left what's happening. The light is coming through the stripes on the curtain and forming this pattern on her chest, her torso. And on the right, which is one of his most famous pictures, it's called Le Violon d'Ingres. And the painter Ingres played the violin as a hobby. So that phrase, Le Violon d'Ingres, became, that's an idiom in French for a hobby. How Man Ray knew this at this early age, early arrival in France, is somewhat mysterious. But he went with that notion. He dressed Kiki in the turban that Ingres had used for many of his odalisques, and then he, looking at her back, he made those two F openings to turn her into basically a violin or a cello. So this notion, I mean, Adon, the first wife, was not exactly a muse. She was more a kind of guide, but all the other women with whom he was seriously involved, they were people that he would portray, and they became, and Kiki herself was extremely theatrical. I mean, she would paint triangles over her eyes. She would put real cherries in her hats. So she was on the same wavelength as Man Ray, and he liked to paint her face basically, and to transform her into an art object. But if you go to the next person, so Lee Miller was the most intense and painful when it broke up, I'd say, relationship of Man Ray's life. She was a remarkable person. When she was very young, she showed up in Paris determined to study with Man Ray. She cornered him in the bar that he frequented, and said, I'm Lee Miller, and I'm your next student to which he replied, "I don't take students. And besides," it was August, "I'm about to go to Biarritz." And she said, "So am I." And that was that. She did. They became lovers. They also, she wasn't exactly his assistant, but she worked in his studio, and she learned to be an important photographer herself, which caused problems, but in their relationship for Man Ray. But I think the main problem in that relationship for Man Ray was sexual jealousy, because she was not a person who would be tied down by anyone or anything. But he, again, if you go to the next slide, you can see that he uses her as a muse too. So that on the left, that is Lee Miller's neck and chin up thrust, and that there's something very characteristic of Man Ray that, in that photograph, which is that he liked to confuse or combine genders, you might say. So there's something phallic about Lee Miller's neck as he's portrayed it in that picture. The one on the right was thought until fairly recently to be Lee Miller, but now they found the contact sheets, and you can see that it's a model because both Lee and Man Ray are photographing her. So, but it's the same sort of thing in which a fragment of a woman, body part, is used theatrically and objectified to make an artistic point.
Arthur,
Yes.
one of the most disturbing parts of the book, I think, is when he talks about his own physical abuse of his first wife. And I know he had other physically abusive relationships as well. I don't want to dwell on that, but if you wanted to say anything about that, and also whether you think that this sort of objectification of seeing women as collections of parts has anything to do with that, or you see that more as, sort of a surrealist fashion.
Yeah, well, the violence, physical violence in the case of Adon, the first wife, well, let me explain what happened. I mean, he said in Selfportrait, his memoir, that she had provoked him into beating her with a strap, and so it's kind of horrifying. And then Kiki, they would they were physically violent towards each other. I mean, she would, she threw an inkwell at him and almost brained him. I mean, so that went back and forth, but it's still a little bit strange, at least to our taste. Not this picture, but another picture of Lee Miller's neck. He worked with glass negatives at that time, and he didn't like what he came up with, and he discarded the glass negative and went out. And Lee was at the studio, and she played around with that negative and manipulated it and printing it and got an image that she liked, and said that it was her image now. And Man Ray was absolutely furious, and he kicked her out of the studio after a big quarrel. And when she came back a few days later, she found that pinned up on the wall, and Man Ray had put a razor to the neck and splashed it with red paint. So red ink, I guess. So that also is a little bit troubling. I don't know that, I mean, the element of violence or sadistic acts towards women and surrealism is a very, there's a lot to be said about that, but not tonight. But it's it is a problematic aspect, I think, of surrealism, and it's almost, it seems to be the flip side of worshiping women is, as surrealists in a certain sense did, in a kind of patronizing way, because they viewed them as this, as I said before, as this kind of link to something primeval. But there's also, and there certainly was in Man Ray, a lot of anger towards women. So yeah, it's one of the more complicated things about him. It's not something that he really chose to analyze himself.
And we have a request for you to mention the dates of the works if you know them offhand.
I'm terrible on dates, but I could probably, but I can refer. But I'm really numbers. I'm much better with words than numbers. So the one on the right is called The Prayer, and it must be around 1932. But let me see if I can get you an exact date. Sorry. Not so good at thumbing through the book either. Oh, hold on.
If it's not handy, it's okay.
No, the book is handy. It's just I can't find the insert. Okay, so Blanche et Noir, the one with the of Kiki earlier. That's not, I'm pretty sure that's 1920. Hold on, that is 1926. La Prière is 1930, as is Anatomies, the one on the left, is thought to be, it's roughly 1930, because that's the period of Lee Miller. And that picture that you saw of Lee Miller, the portrait, was taken in 1929. So I will try going forward to give dates on these various works of art. Okay, so I guess we can go to the next slide. So after Lee Miller left him, and he was suicidal for a while and really deeply unhappy, and then after a while he got over it, and he took up with this woman whose name is Addie Fidelin, and she was from Guadeloupe, biracial, and a dancer, and she was very different from the three previous women that I've described, because she was you know, she would put slippers on his feet. I mean, she was very doting and not at all combative in the way that these other women, and not at all, I don't know if you could call those other women competitive, but they were independent, I guess is a better way of putting it. And she was not. And they were, they seemed happy. But then that relationship ended because of the war, and Man Ray was going to take her with him to America, but at the last minute she decided that no, she didn't want to do that. So she stayed behind, and she wound up, she took care of work that Man Ray left behind, and she wound up marrying a Frenchman. And then the final one after Addie is in this campy picture, which I couldn't resist including in the book. That's his second wife, Juliet Browner was her name, and then she became known as Juliet Man Ray. And they were married until his death. He met her in Los Angeles. They lived together in Los Angeles, and then she moved with him when he wanted to go back to Paris, even though, again, she spoke no French and she had no real experience abroad, but they, yeah, they lived there, and she would sit in the studio, which was terribly unheated and freezing, actually. It was like a big garage, and keep him company while he painted, not even speaking, but he derived comfort, I dare say, from the relationship and from her proximity to him.
All right, so
she, by the way, had been a dancer, like Addie. She also had been a dancer, and like Addie, she also doted on him. And as William Copley, a friend of both of theirs, really, an art dealer and later an artist, said, she worshipped him.
unlikely Miller, I guess, and who's, by the way, is featured at the Metropolitan Museum right now in their show of women photographers, and she took some famous images of the liberation of Dachau, which Man Ray was, nowhere near Europe at that point. So, like, we think of him today mostly, or he's known mostly as a photographer, but in his lifetime, according to your book, he really wanted to be known more as a painter. So do you know why that was?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's easy because when Man Ray was alive, he died in 1976, photography was not truly considered to be an art, or if it was an art, it was a secondary art. It was really only in the 70s. I mean, coincidentally, the book I published last was the photographer Deanne Arbus, and it's really Arbus in 1970-71 who appeared. She was the first photographer to appear in Art Forum. She was actually her picture was on the cover of Art Forum, and pictures she'd taken. And she was the first photographer to be included in the American Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. So it was really, the whole notion of art photography was almost prenatal. I mean, it was just gestating at that time. So it made sense that Man Ray wanted to be thought of as a painter. But one of the, it's not an irony really, but he was in Paris with the greatest painters of the 20th century. So he knew Picasso quite well. I mean, they were friends. He photographed Matisse and knew Matisse, although they were not friends in the same way. So as a painter, he couldn't really approach their level. But as a photographer, he was extraordinarily innovative. And he also had this kind of mechanical bent, which really lent itself to photography because, it's a mechanical art. So even though he would deprecate the importance of the camera and the printing process and all the things that make photography mechanical, he was really good at it and really creative at it. So he came up, he had this wonderful combination of inventiveness and methodicalness, if that's a word. And so he would, well, we could talk about it a little bit later maybe, but he could take an invention of his and really run variations on it in a very productive way.
And he invented something called a radiograph, right?
Exactly, yeah. And I think, we have a picture of a radiograph. Maybe that's the next one. Oh, no, I was going to just mention in passing, sorry. So it's almost a sort of joke, but all those relationships were obviously very important, but the most important relationship, I think, of Man Ray's life was with Duchamp. And as I said before, he photographed Duchamp in various ways. And this is Duchamp in his alter ego as someone he called Rose C'est la vie. And Rose C'est la vie is a kind of, middle-class French woman who's seeking respectability. And just, for today's, it's of interest to note that Duchamp, when he first was trying to figure out what alter ego he would create, thought of becoming a Jew. He was a Protestant from, anyways, from Rouen. Maybe he was Catholic. I should know that. But anyway, he was a Christian. And he couldn't come up, he said, with a Jewish name that he liked. So he then thought, it'd be easier anyway to become a woman. So he became a woman. And this, and that transformation, which other surrealists, Andre Breton said, I wish I could change my sex the way I changed my shirt. So he wasn't unique in that kind of thinking, but he did it with a lot of panache, and Man Ray documented it. So anyway, so I thought we would just add Duchamp at the end of the real women and the women who he was actually romantically involved, as opposed to Duchamp, who was just his best friend. So yes, the radiograph, maybe, is that the next? Yes, the radiograph. So yeah, this is one of the things that Man Ray didn't exactly invent, but he explored in a way that nobody else had done as successfully. So the origins of the radiograph, which is really what's known as a photogram, it's an image on photosensitive paper that is made without a camera. And it had been done since the very beginnings of photography in the mid-19th century. A lot of people used it for things like botanical specimens that you would put right on the paper, and then you would get the direct image. So Man Ray at that time was using very large glass plates and exposing them to get a negative, and then printing them. And you, in the darkroom, you shine the light on the glass plate. Briefly, it exposes the photosensitive paper, and then you develop the paper in a bath. And the paper is sort of expensive, and he put the paper in the bath, and one of them, he realized to his chagrin, he had forgotten to expose with a negative. So he just, annoyed, put it aside and put a few things on it. And when he turned on the light, what happened was the light exposed the paper that was not covered by the things. This is not the original one. I mean, this is not the patient zero of radiographs, but he found in a similar way that the things that were on the photosensitive paper blocked the development of the paper, so that the paper, the background becomes black and the objects become white. Well, he really ran with this and did various all kinds of maneuverings, which I describe in the book, to get different effects from that. Now, the only thing that is slightly problematic about this story, which he tells in his Selfportrait, is that he was friendly with this man Tristan Tzara, a Romanian Jew actually, who was a father of Dada. And Tristan Tzara was living in the same hotel as Man Ray, and they were friends. And Tristan Tzara had brought to Paris the photographs, which he called, Tristan Tzara called shadographs, because they were the work of an artist named Christian Schad, who had done them 3 years before Man Ray, differently, not in a dark room, but using photosensitive paper in daylight, but still had done something very much like it. And anyway, Man Ray credits Tristan Tzara with coming up with the name Radiograph, as he had come up with the name Shadowgraph. I mean, both of them are in the English language anyway, plays on light. So I don't know. It's one of those stories. I mean, Man Ray liked to talk about things having happened as accidents. No one else was there. Well, so in a later accident, Lee Miller was actually there for solarization. So that probably was an accident. With radiographs, I don't know. It's possible that the solarization accident later made him go back retroactively and say that this was an accident too. I don't think we'll ever know, but at any rate, he did many radiographs, and they're beautiful, I think.
So he did a lot of this experimentation, but he made most of his money through fashion photography and celebrity portraiture.
Right. Before we go on this one, though, let me just point out, I mean, it's clear to me, but that's a lemon and a pipe and a mushroom and a necklace. So just so that you see that those are the objects that he put on the paper. Anyway, yes, he made a little money from radiographs, but you're right, he didn't really make much money from radiographs. So yeah, if we go to the next slide, you can see, so I didn't actually reprint any fashion photographs as photographs in the book. So, but what you do see is that as a photographer, he had a really unconventional, original, upended way of looking at things. So I love this picture, and it's a woman smoking a cigarette, but it's not in the way that you normally would see a woman smoking a cigarette. It's not taken from that angle. So that when Man Ray depicts her, her hair becomes like a wheat field, and the cigarette becomes almost like a little smokestack, and it's just a very arresting image that makes you do a double take. And when Man Ray, so there were two ways that Man Ray went to Paris, and he had enough money to stay for a few months, but he had no way to make a living really, and no one was buying his paintings. I mean, they liked the paintings in Paris more than they had in New York, but they still weren't actually buying the paintings. So he needed to make a living. And one that, as I mentioned before, he had learned how to photograph his own paintings when he was still in New York. So when he got to Paris and he met Francis Picabia, who was a rich painter, Picabia very nicely retained Man Ray to photograph his own paintings, which was a way, and that actually led, because Picabia was very well connected, to other artists doing the same. And when he would photograph their paintings, he would typically, at the end of it, ask if he could photograph the artist. So it actually developed into portraiture as well as photography of artwork. And also through Picabia, Man Ray met Jean Cocteau, who also kind of knew everybody. And actually it was Cocteau who brought Man Ray to photograph the dead Proust on his deathbed. But that was another way, and that was a way of making money. But fashion photography actually came through Picabia's wife, who was very well connected among couturiers, and was a particular friend of Paul Poiret, who was a very successful fashion designer and had a big house and a complex really on the Faubourg du Saint-Honoré. And so Man Ray went there with pictures like this, right? And because he didn't have a portfolio as a fashion photographer. And Poiret was not fazed by that at all, and said that he liked Man Ray's eye, and that he would, and he hired him. And then if you see the next picture, it's not exactly a fashion picture either, but it, well, let's,
Is it the next one?
I think it's the next one, yeah. Yeah, it's that one. So, so this thing, this picture, which is called Glass Tears, it's a real woman, and the tears are artificial. And that was one of the things, I mean, that was a surrealist game, but it was a game that Man Ray was particularly good at. It's hard, I mean, in some ways, the tears look more real than the woman in this picture. And that was something that, one of the things that Man Ray played around with his fashion photography. So he often photographed women's gowns on mannequins, but the mannequins begin to look real and like they were actually living women, and that appealed to Poiret and also to other fashion designers. So yeah, so he became quite successful commercially doing that, and he worked for for many magazines, and you know, made a good living. I mean, he lived quite well in Paris very, very soon.
You mentioned briefly about the fact that he had to flee France during the war. To your knowledge, did he ever address or talk about the Holocaust in any way during or after that time?
Not as far as I know. He did talk about the way the color of the uniforms of the German soldiers were like a stain on Paris. It was a kind of, I think, no, what he at least talked about publicly was more of a French horror than a Jewish horror. You know, it was of being conquered and having these barbarians basically going through the city that he loved, but not unlike, as you said before, Lee Miller, who was fearless and who stayed in London during the Blitz and then went for the liberation of concentration camps, who also photographed German, like Gestapo people and other collaborators or worse of the Nazis who were killed as in acts of revenge. He photographed their corpses. I mean, Man Ray didn't do anything like that. No.
So he spent a lot of post-war years in Los Angeles. What was that time like for him?
Yeah, well, he came back to America. He came to New York. He really didn't like New York. His family was in New York. That probably didn't help. But he also, I think the fact that New York was an artistic capital, but it was an artistic capital in which he was not appreciated, just salted that wound even more. So he went out to Los Angeles. He thought, or at least he said he thought, that he was going to keep going and go to a Pacific island, be kind of like Gauguin or something. But he stopped in Los Angeles, well, I think in large part because he met Juliet there. And that relationship started up very quickly. And Juliet was also visiting Los Angeles from New York. She was a New Yorker. He didn't like Los Angeles, really. I mean, he said it was, everything about it was stifling except for the weather. And even the weather, in his studio, he allowed dust and dirt to streak the windows so that the light would be filtered the way it had been in Paris. So he really missed Paris. And he had shows on the West Coast, but he didn't sell anything except to friends. And he wasn't really appreciated there. And for the first part of his tenure, he was reproducing works, not exactly in the same way, but very closely. I mean, doing reprises or rough facsimiles of work that he thought was lost, that he'd left behind in Paris. Now, that work was, as it turned out, not lost. So it came back eventually. But to my mind, there was a real cut between his career up until 1940, which again is half his life because he lived to be 86, and what came after, because that creativity of his younger days, I don't think came back in after the forced exile, and then even the return to Paris.
You talked about the fact that he was constantly, reinventing himself, and for that reason isn't really known by a single style. Do you think that has affected his fame in subsequent generations?
I think in some ways it has. I think it's, if you can recognize immediately with like an artist like Francis Bacon, or even Roy Lichtenstein, or to some extent Andy Warhol, or Jean-Michel Basquiat. I mean, there's a brand attached. Man Ray doesn't really have a brand of that sort. I mean, in some ways, it's helped his current reputation that he doesn't have a brand, right? So there's something that cuts both ways about that. But yes, I think there's no immediately recognizable Man Ray trademark or hallmark that one can point to, and that probably has affected, at least in the wider public, kept him perhaps from being even better. I mean, he's pretty well known, but being even better known than he is.
Well, there were certainly iconic images, certain photographs that are recognizable. So let's talk a little bit about his legacy. He had a little bit of a revival in the 1970s.
I think it's really happened later than that. And it's really, if you go to the next image, I mean, I think you can see he did early on things that, okay, this is a really, okay, I should tell you what year it was. I want to say it was 1917, but let me see. I'm really sorry. I'm very bad on dates, including dates of my own life. So this is Self-Portrait. Let's say it's around 1917. Oh, here we go. 1916, I think. Yeah, 1916. So this object, which he calls Selfportrait, and that's his hand on it. It's two bells on the top and a button on the bottom. And you push the button and nothing happens. So as he said, people were outraged. They thought I was a bad electrician. But what that kind of interactive object was way, way, way ahead of its time as an artist. I mean, he did very early mobiles. I mean, arguably the first mobiles. If you go to, I don't have an image of that here, but if you go to the next slide. So this is what I was describing before with Stieglitz. So this is an object that he made. There's a man named Isidore Ducasse, who styled himself as the Comte de Lautréamont, had this wonderful sentence, which goes like this, I believe. As lovely as the chance encounter of a sewing machine as lovely as the chance encounter on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. So Man Ray wrapped a sewing machine in burlap, photographed it, and then disassembled it. And that again, this is about, oh, I don't know, 1917. Let's see what year it is. No, a little later, 1920. But it's still, you know, really early for that kind of assemblage. And also the fact that it's not an object, but that it's an object, it's a photograph of an object, and that was the artwork. That also was, it seems, I mean, it was very ahead of its time. And the sort of thing that artists today get in a way that artists at that time did not get. And if you go to the next slide, so this Man Ray made on the spur of the moment. It's called the Giftlikado, and he just went to a hardware store actually at the opening of his first show in Paris, 6 months after he arrived in Paris, and with Eric Satie, who had befriended him at the party for the opening, even though they didn't speak each other's language. And they went to a hardware store, and Man Ray bought this, you know, old-fashioned, but not old-fashioned then, iron, and bought nails that he glued to the iron. So it turns the function of the iron into something completely non-functional. And as Arturo Schwartz, who later produced editions of Man Ray's objects, noted, there is often something sadistic in Man Ray's objects, and there certainly is in this one. Next slide. Let's see if we have another example too. Yeah, and this one, speaking of sadistic, so this is called Object to be Destroyed. And this, yeah, I thought this was not a bad way to close. That's Lee Miller's eye. And Man Ray had earlier made this metronome, which he kept in his studio with a woman's eye on it. And he replaced it with with Lee Miller's eye. And he wrote with it that, again, I'm paraphrasing, but that you keep it going until you finally can bear it no longer, the eye of somebody who has left you, and then you try to destroy it with one blow of a hammer. So he was a complicated person, Man Ray. He didn't actually, you have to tease out the complications because he didn't really want to dwell on them. He was not a very self-reflective or, in that sense, expressive artist, but he was a very inventive artist, and he was a very complicated guy. And I tried best I could to parse some of that out in this book.
Great. We're coming up on 7 o'clock, so I'm going to take a couple of questions quickly. Did you want to say anything about the painting that we passed by?
Well, if you want to call it back, I mean, I could just say very quickly that that is in some ways his most iconic painting, but I don't know if you can find it quickly.
There it is.
That's okay, there it is. So that's Lee Miller's mouth. He worked on that painting for a long time after she left him. That's the skyline, that's the observatory. It's called Observatory Time, The Lovers. And the only, you can see that the lips are also suggestive of two bodies pressed together. And in fact, it was this picture hung over the entrance of the, again, now legendary Museum of Modern Art show on Dada and Surrealism in 1936 until they took it down because it was thought to be obscene. So, but this is probably Man Ray's most famous painting.
Okay, let's take a couple of questions quickly. How did you get interested in Man Ray?
Well, if you're interested, I'm interested in photography, and I especially got interested in photography after D.N. Arbus. So if you're interested in photography, Man Ray is a towering figure. And so, and I didn't know, well, I know a lot more now. So I knew, I was familiar with a number of the works, but I didn't know so much about his method. And I wanted to know, with D.N. Arbus, I had connected her way of looking at the world, which she wrote about very expressively, with the photographs she took. It was more of a challenge with Man Ray because he didn't talk as openly as Arbus did. So anyway, but that's how I got interested.
Did his friends in Paris, Duchamp, Breton, know Man Ray was Jewish?
Oh, Duchamp certainly did. Yes, they did, and Breton did as well. Yes, I mean it's one of those open secrets. I mean, in the way that well, somebody like Cocteau was not so open about being homosexual, but like Max Jacob, everyone knew that he was gay, but people didn't really talk about it.
There's a question, were these types of images illegal at the time? I'm not sure which ones they were referring to, but was there anything Duchamp, Man Ray was doing that was considered obscene or would have been considered illegal?
Yeah. We don't reproduce them in the book either. He did a series of 4 photographs of himself having sex with Kiki, and he'd taken these pictures, again, way ahead of their time. They're pornographic pictures, and they're categorical. They're anal sex, oral sex, vaginal sex, and he had them in a drawer. And then the surrealist friends of his were putting out a publication that they actually wanted to be confiscated as obscene, bringing it back into France. And they asked him if he had anything to accompany this obscene poem. And lo and behold, he did. And he gave them those pictures. And you can see them. I mean, each one has the name of a season. So if you put Printemps Man Ray on the internet, you'll find it.
Here's a question, was Christo influenced by Man Ray? I'm guessing that was because of the wrapping they're asking that question.
I don't know specifically about Christo, but Man Ray has been very influential. So I think, even somebody like Mapplethorpe, that you wouldn't think, Mapplethorpe said that he thought that Man Ray was the greatest photographer because he was so inventive. I mean, his influence, especially among photographers, but I would say in the arts in general, is very great.
This question, what about Bernice Abbott?
Well, Bernice Abbott, yes, was again, she's in the book, but I didn't have time to talk about her now. She worked with him. She didn't know anything about photography when she came to be his assistant. He taught her. She then, of course, became a great photographer on her own, but he took her in. He knew her a little bit from New York, and she was starving in Paris. So he gave her a way to make a living. And then she said that it's in the book, I won't get it quite right, but she thought his photographs of men were very good, but his photographs of women were not so good.
We have time for one more question. His metronome and objects like the eye appear in paintings by surrealists. Did he know Max Ernst and the French group? Yes,
he knew about Max Ernst so well that, in fact, when Max Ernst and Dorothea Tanning came to Los Angeles to get married, Man Ray and Juliet joined them in a double wedding. So yes, Max Ernst was one. Man Ray had this great gift for friendship, and he knew, all the surrealists would fight with each other, but they never fought with Man Ray. He was friendly with all different factions of surrealists and Dadaists.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I did put the code in the chat to order the discounted copy of the book with free shipping, and I highly recommend that you do that. This was really interesting, and I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you to everyone for joining. Have a good night.
Yeah, my thanks.